On a rain-soaked field in northern England, in the dying light of September 9th, 1513, a king walked into the mouth of his own destruction. He came with the largest army Scotland had ever assembled, 30,000 men sworn to his banner, nobles who believed their king invincible, commanders who trusted his vision of modern warfare, and artillery that was supposed to announce Scotland as a European power. In less than 3 hours, all of it would be gone. The king would die with a sword in his hand. His nobles would fall in formation around him, keeping an oath more ancient than memory, and Scotland would wake the next morning to discover it had lost not just a battle, but its entire ruling class, its military elite, its political future, and any illusion that it could stand as England's equal. This was not Bannockburn. There would be no William Wallace rising from the ashes. There would be no Robert the Bruce to rebuild what was shattered. The man who would inherit the Scottish crown was 17 months old, and the men who should have guided him were buried in foreign soil, their blood soaking into English earth alongside the dream that Scotland could choose its wars and win them. The field itself seemed to know what was coming. Flodden Edge rose from the borderlands like a monument to older wars, its slopes slick with September rain, its summit wrapped in mist that clung to armor and made every banner hang limp and heavy. This was the country between kingdoms, the land that had drunk blood for 3 centuries, where every farm remembered a raid and every village a burning. The year was 1513, and Europe was tearing itself apart in the way Europe always did, great powers colliding while smaller nations chose sides and prayed they had chosen correctly. Somewhere to the south, the English king Henry VIII was trying to carve his name into French soil. Somewhere to the north, the Scottish king James IV was assembling an army that would make the world notice Scotland again. And on this ridge, on this field, with the evening closing in and the rain beginning to fall harder, all those ambitions, all those prayers, all those carefully laid plans were about to collide with the oldest truth warfare has ever known, that numbers mean nothing when the ground betrays you, and courage means nothing when the tactics are wrong. James IV of Scotland was not supposed to die young. He was not supposed to die at all. At least not like this, not on a muddy field with English steel opening his throat. He was supposed to be the king who transformed Scotland, the Renaissance prince who spoke 6 languages and funded universities, who brought printing presses to Edinburgh and Italian architects to his court, who modernized his artillery and corresponded with scholars across Europe and truly believed, that Scotland could step out of England's shadow and claim a seat at the table where real power was negotiated. He had inherited a kingdom that was poor, isolated and traumatized by generations of English invasion, and he had spent 25 years trying to prove that poverty and isolation were choices, not fate. He funded the navy, he strengthened the castles, he forged alliances with France and Denmark and anyone else who might counterbalance English power. And when Henry VIII invaded France in the summer of 1513, when the French Queen wrote to James begging him to honor the Auld Alliance and strike at England while its king was abroad, James saw not obligation but opportunity. This would be Scotland's moment. This would be the campaign that announced James as more than a border king, more than the ruler of a stubborn little nation that refused to die but never quite managed to thrive. This would be the war that changed everything. He was 40 years old, in the prime of his power, commanding an army larger and better equipped than any Scottish force in living memory, and every man who marched south with him believed they were writing a new chapter in Scotland's story, one where they finally won. But England had other plans. England always had other plans, and this time those plans were in the hands of Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, a man who had survived the Wars of the Roses and learned warfare in a harder school than James could imagine. Howard was 70 years old, a veteran of battles so brutal they had no place in Renaissance fantasies of chivalric combat. And when he received word that the Scottish army had crossed the border and was fortifying positions in Northumberland, he did not panic and he did not despair. He gathered what forces he could, perhaps 26,000 men, outnumbered but experienced, hungry for the kind of victory that might secure their own lands and families against Scottish raids for another generation. These were men who knew the border, who had fought Scots before, who understood that Scottish armies were dangerous when they held high ground and fought defensively but vulnerable when they could be forced into open battle on broken terrain. And Howard understood something else, something that James in his Renaissance confidence had forgotten. That all the artillery in the world meant nothing if you couldn't deploy it properly. That all the modern tactics meant nothing if your men couldn't execute them on unstable ground. And that all the numerical advantage meant nothing if your enemy could dictate where and how the battle was fought. Howard looked at the maps, studied the reports of Scottish positions on Flodden Edge, and made a decision that would kill a king. He would maneuver around the Scottish flank, cut their supply lines, and force them to come down from their hill and fight on ground that favored English tactics. It was a gamble. If James held his position, Howard's smaller force would be trapped between the Scottish army and starvation. But Howard was betting on something he knew about kings, especially young kings, especially proud kings, that they would rather fight than be outmaneuvered, that they would rather risk everything than accept the humiliation of watching an enemy army slip past them. This was the promise written in the rain and the gathering dark, that whatever happened in the next few hours would not be a skirmish or a raid or another border clash that would be forgotten in a generation. This would be absolute. This would be the kind of battle that ended dynasties or founded them, that erased futures or guaranteed them. Both armies understood it. Both commanders understood it. And somewhere in the Scottish camp, as messengers brought word that Howard had moved his army to their rear and was threatening their line of retreat, James faced the choice that would define his legacy and his kingdom: stay on the hill and risk being starved out or humiliated, or march down into the valley and fight the kind of pitched battle that modern European armies were supposed to win. He chose combat. He chose glory. He chose to prove that Scotland had evolved beyond the guerrilla tactics of Wallace and Bruce, that they could face England in open battle with continental weapons and continental formations and win through discipline and firepower rather than through desperation and terrain. It was the worst decision he ever made, and 3 hours later he would be dead because of it. But to understand why 30,000 Scotsmen followed their king into that trap, you have to go back decades, back to the moment when James inherited a throne that should have broken him. He was 15 years old when he became king, crowned over his father's corpse after a rebellion that James himself had been manipulated into supporting. James III had died at Sauchiburn, killed by men who claimed to act in the prince's name, and young James IV spent the rest of his life haunted by the knowledge that he wore a crown purchased with his father's blood. He wore an iron chain around his waist for the rest of his life as penance, adding a new link each year, a private torture that never left him. But that guilt, that shame, that desperate need to prove himself worthy of the crown he had helped steal, it made him a different kind of king. It made him hungry, hungry to be loved where his father had been hated, hungry to be strong where his father had been weak, hungry to make Scotland matter in a world that largely ignored it. He married Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, in 1503, a marriage that was supposed to bring perpetual peace between Scotland and England. He patronized poets and musicians, built palaces, expanded the Scottish navy until it boasted ships that could challenge anything on the North Sea. He was everything a Renaissance king was supposed to be: cultured, ambitious, forward-thinking, cosmopolitan. But he was also bound by older loyalties, older promises, older obligations that no amount of Renaissance sophistication could erase. The Auld Alliance with France had been renewed in 1491, a treaty that stated clearly, if England attacked France, Scotland would open a second front in the north. It was a suicide pact dressed up as diplomacy, a promise that guaranteed Scotland would be dragged into every major European war, whether it wanted to be or not. And in 1513, when Henry VIII sailed for France with dreams of reconquering the English possessions lost in the 100 Years' War, when the French Queen sent James a ring and a letter begging him to be her champion. James was trapped between the king he wanted to be and the king his kingdom needed him to be. He wanted to be the wise Renaissance prince who stayed neutral, who protected his people, who understood that Scotland had nothing to gain from war with England. But he needed to be the loyal ally, the honorable knight, the king who kept his word even when keeping it meant risking everything. And so he chose honor, he chose the alliance, he chose war. The English commanders knew it was coming. The English always knew it was coming because the Scots always came when England was distracted elsewhere. And this time was no different. But what shocked them, what genuinely terrified them, was the size of the army James brought south. 30,000 men was not a raiding party. 30,000 men was not a border skirmish. 30,000 men was an invasion force, the kind of army that could besiege castles and occupy territory and genuinely threaten English control of the north. And these were not the same Scots who had fought at Bannockburn or Stirling Bridge. Armies of desperate men with improvised weapons and tactics born of necessity. These were men equipped with continental pikes, 18-foot lances that in Swiss and German hands had revolutionized European warfare. Weapons that were supposed to make cavalry charges obsolete and turn infantry into an unstoppable phalanx of steel. James had imported military advisors from France and the Holy Roman Empire. He had drilled his men in the new formations. He had brought siege artillery, massive bronze cannons that were supposed to announce Scotland's arrival as a modern military power. On paper, this was the most formidable Scottish army in history, an army that combined Scottish courage with European tactics, an army that should have been able to challenge England on equal terms and win. But paper tactics work beautifully right up until the moment they meet reality, and reality in September 1513 was a muddy field in Northumberland, where the ground was too soft for proper pike formations, and the enemy was too experienced to fight the kind of set-piece battle James had trained for. The Scots fortified their position on Flodden Edge and waited for the English to attack. They waited for days, watching Howard's army maneuver in the valley below, confident that no commander would be foolish enough to assault a defended hill when the defenders outnumbered him and held every advantage of terrain. But Howard didn't attack the hill. Howard went around it. He marched his army north and east, moving behind the Scottish position, threatening their supply lines and their route of retreat back to Scotland. It was a brilliant maneuver, the kind of operational level thinking that separated experienced commanders from merely competent ones, and it put James in an impossible position. If he stayed on the hill, he would be cut off, his army slowly starving while the English controlled the roads home. If he abandoned the hill without fighting, he would look like a coward, and kings who looked like cowards didn't stay kings for very long. And if he marched down to fight on ground of Howard's choosing, he would be giving up every advantage he had worked so hard to secure. There was no good choice. There was no clever solution. There was only the choice between slow humiliation and quick resolution, between strategic patience and tactical aggression, between the king James wanted to be and the warrior his men expected him to be. And so, on the morning of September 9th, James gave the order to abandon the high ground and march to battle. His nobles tried to dissuade him. His advisors warned him the ground was wrong, that the English position was too strong, that this was exactly the battle Howard wanted to fight. But James had come too far, committed too much, staked too much of his reputation on this campaign to turn back now. He had promised to be France's champion. He had promised to teach England respect. He had promised his men glory and his kingdom security and himself redemption for all the years he had worn that iron chain around his waist. And so they marched down from the high ground, 30,000 men in continental formation, pikes held high, banners streaming in the wind, convinced they were about to write a new chapter in Scottish history. They were right about that at least. Just not the chapter they imagined. The rain came harder as the armies closed, turning the ground into soup, making every step a struggle, transforming the neat parade ground formations into something chaotic and desperate. The The Scottish artillery, which had performed so impressively in demonstrations and practice, proved almost useless in combat, the carriages sinking into mud, the gunners unable to depress their barrels enough to hit targets below them, the powder dampened by the constant drizzle. The English artillery, smaller but more maneuverable, pounded the Scottish lines with impunity, tearing holes in formations that had been so carefully drilled, so meticulously organized. And then the English archers opened fire, thousands of longbowmen who had been practicing their craft since childhood, men who could put an arrow through armor at 200 yards, men who turned the sky dark with their volleys and watched as Scottish noblemen, proud men in expensive armor, fell with shafts through their throats and faces and the gaps in their plate. The Scots tried to charge, tried to close the distance before the arrows could slaughter them completely, but the ground betrayed them. The 18-foot pikes, those wonderful continental weapons that worked so beautifully on the firm ground of Swiss valleys, became liabilities in the mud of Northumberland. They were too long to control properly, too heavy to maneuver on uncertain footing. Men slipped and fell and dragged their neighbors down with them. Formations that were supposed to move as a single irresistible mass instead fragmented into clusters of confused soldiers trying not to fall on their own weapons. And the English infantry, equipped with shorter bills and halberds, weapons designed for close combat on broken ground, closed in like butchers approaching cattle. The Scottish right flank held briefly, the reserve barely engaged, but the center and left collapsed into something that wasn't warfare anymore, just slaughter, just desperate men swinging weapons in the rain, while English soldiers methodically cut them down with the practiced efficiency of professionals who had done this before and would do it again. And then James made his final, fatal decision. He could have pulled back. He could have tried to rally his reserves, establish a new defensive line, save what could be saved. But James IV was not a king who pulled back. James IV was a king who had spent his entire reign trying to prove he deserved the crown, who had worn a chain of guilt and penance around his waist since he was 15 years old, who had promised his allies and his ancestors and himself that Scotland would no longer be the kingdom that survived by running away. So when his center began to collapse, when the carefully planned formations dissolved into chaos, when the English infantry began cutting through his lines like they were harvesting wheat, James did not retreat. James advanced. He gathered his household guard, his closest nobles, the men who had sworn to die before letting harm come to their king, and he led them straight into the English center, straight into the place where the fighting was thickest, straight into the mouth of the beast. It was magnificently brave. It was tactically insane. It was the kind of gesture that would be remembered in poems and songs. The king fighting alongside his men, refusing to ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. And it killed him. An English billman, some anonymous soldier whose name no one bothered to record, struck James down in the press of combat, and suddenly the King of Scotland was just another corpse on a muddy field, his expensive armor and royal blood meaning nothing to the blade that opened his throat. Around him, Scotland's nobility died, trying to protect a king who was already dead, trying to fulfill oaths that were already broken, trying to salvage honor from a disaster that had no honor left in it. The Earl of Montrose fell. The Earl of Bothwell fell. The Earl of Crawford, the Earl of Lennox, the Archbishop of St. Andrews, the Bishop of the Isles. They all fell, cut down in a span of minutes that erased Scotland's ruling class like a scythe through grain. The Scottish army didn't retreat. It disintegrated. Men who had marched south in perfect formation, confident in their king and their tactics and their place in history, ran north in terror, throwing down their weapons, abandoning their armor, desperate only to reach the border before the English cavalry ran them down. Some made it. Most didn't. The killing went on for hours. English soldiers pursuing fleeing Scotsmen across miles of countryside, cutting down men who were too exhausted to fight anymore, too broken to resist. By the time darkness finally brought mercy, the field at Flodden was a carpet of corpses, Scottish noblemen lying in heaps where they had made their final stand. Common soldiers scattered across the hillside where they had died running. The English had won so completely that they couldn't quite believe it. They had faced the largest army Scotland had ever assembled, led by a king who was supposed to be brilliant, equipped with the latest military technology, trained in continental tactics, and they had destroyed it, not defeated it, not turned it back, destroyed it, killed the king, killed the nobility, killed the army, killed the threat. The estimated Scottish dead numbered between 10 and 17,000 men, a staggering percentage of the army, a loss so catastrophic that almost every noble family in Scotland would be in mourning. Almost every community would be missing fathers and brothers and sons. In the rain and the gathering dark, as English soldiers moved across the field, stripping corpses and finishing wounded, someone found a body wearing royal armor, a dead king lying face down in the mud with multiple wounds, his throat cut, his face so damaged that identification was difficult. They carried it to Thomas Howard, and Howard looked at what remained of James IV of Scotland and understood that something enormous had just happened. This wasn't just a tactical victory. This was the kind of strategic triumph that changed kingdoms, that altered the balance of power for generations. England had killed a king, not just defeated him, not just humiliated him, but actually killed him on the battlefield. The last time a British monarch would die that way, and with him they had killed Scotland's political future, because the heir to the throne was a 17-month-old child named James V, and the men who should have served as his regents, who should have guided Scotland through the crisis, were corpses rotting in English soil. The Scottish succession was a disaster waiting to happen. The kingdom would descend into faction and civil war, multiple regencies fighting for control, English influence spreading like poison through a weakened court, decades of instability that would leave Scotland vulnerable in ways it had never been before. Scotland woke to the news slowly, in pieces, the way bad news always arrives when it's too terrible to be believed all at once. A messenger reaching Edinburgh with news of defeat. Another messenger with news of casualties. A third messenger with the news that no one wanted to hear, that no one could quite process. The king is dead. James IV, the Renaissance prince, the cultured monarch, the man who was supposed to transform Scotland. Dead on an English field, killed fighting in the front lines like some medieval warlord, like the world hadn't changed, like all his modernization and sophistication and enlightenment had meant nothing in the end. The mourning that followed was unlike anything Scotland had experienced since the Wars of Independence. Every noble family had lost someone. Every community had sent men who never came home. The Scottish Parliament could barely meet because so many of its members were dead. The country didn't just lose a battle. It lost a generation. It lost its leadership, its military command, its political elite. The survivors tried to piece together what happened, tried to understand how the largest and best-equipped army in Scottish history had been so completely annihilated, but there were no good answers. The tactics had been wrong. The ground had been wrong. The decision to fight had been wrong. James had been betrayed by his own ambitions, by his desire to prove Scotland was a modern European power, by his commitment to an alliance that had never truly served Scottish interests. He had died, trying to be a Renaissance king, but he had died in the most medieval way possible, butchered in close combat by anonymous English soldiers who didn't care about his education or his languages or his patronage of the arts. He had died, proving that courage and nobility and honor meant nothing without the tactical sense to use them properly. The succession fell to James V, a baby who would grow up knowing his father as a legend and a cautionary tale, a king who was both hero and fool, both Renaissance prince and medieval ghost. The regency was a nightmare, factions tearing Scotland apart from within, while England hovered at the border, always threatening, always dangerous, always ready to exploit any weakness. Scotland survived, the way it always survived, through stubbornness and determination, and a refusal to disappear, no matter how badly the odds were stacked against it. But it was never the same. It never again assembled an army of 30,000 men to invade England. It never again tried to fight England on equal terms in open battle. The dream that James IV had died for, The dream of Scotland as an independent power that could choose its wars and win them died with him in the mud at Flodden. What came instead was a slow, grinding acknowledgement of reality, that Scotland and England were not equals, that they never had been, that all the courage and tactics and modernization in the world couldn't change the fundamental imbalance in population and resources and strategic position. The path to the Union of Crowns in 1603, when James VI of Scotland inherited the English throne and united the kingdoms under a single monarch, was paved with lessons learned at Flodden. Scotland couldn't beat England, but maybe, just maybe, it could join it. Maybe the only way to survive was to stop fighting. Flodden echoes through Scottish history like a wound that never quite healed. The field itself is quiet now, farmland mostly, the dead long buried, the blood long washed away by centuries of rain. But every Scottish child learns about it, the day their king died for an alliance that meant nothing, for a war that achieved nothing, for a dream of greatness that ended in a muddy field with English steel and English victory, and the long, slow realization that some battles aren't worth fighting, no matter how much honor demands it. James IV wanted to be remembered as the king who transformed Scotland. Instead, he's remembered as the king who died trying, the last king brave enough or foolish enough to believe that courage alone could overcome English power. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the memory of a king dying in the front lines, fighting alongside his men, refusing to abandon the field even when the field had already abandoned him. Maybe that's the kind of legacy that matters more than victory. Maybe Scotland lost everything at Flodden except the one thing that always mattered most: the stubborn, bloody-minded refusal to disappear, to submit, to admit that they were finished. They lost their king. They lost their nobles. They lost any hope of military victory. But they kept existing, kept fighting in other ways, kept surviving long enough to see their king's great-great-grandson sit on the English throne, ruling both kingdoms from Edinburgh as much as from London. Flodden didn't destroy Scotland. It destroyed one version of Scotland, the version that thought it could win through force. What survived was harder, smarter, more patient, more willing to play the long game. And that, in the end, was the real legacy of the day Scotland lost its king.